Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the unethical history of human experimentation in America. I am Danielle. We are specifically going to be covering Project MKUltra, which was a top secret CIA project that ran from 1953 to 1973. It is a very, very fascinating topic, if I must say. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this presentation. Okay, so first thing we're going to cover is the context of this period. So the 1950s, like what was going on during this time that we need to know. So basically, the first thing is that drug culture was huge, right? Particularly psychedelics, and not a lot of research had been conducted regarding the negative effects of them. So really, there was still a very, very lot, like many issues and questions surrounding how drugs worked and what side effects they had and what they could really do to a person, which was very important during the experiments, and that's really what the CIA was trying to figure out when they were conducting Project MKUltra. But the second thing you need to know is that the U.S. had won World War II only a few years earlier, and we had this kind of post-war optimism that made us think that we could sort of accomplish anything, even if it does seem kind of crazy today. Like during this, like with U.S. intelligence agencies in the 1950s, we thought that we could figure out the secret behind time travel. We thought we could make things invisible. Like these were real operations going on within our government at the time that resulted like from that kind of post-war optimism, that kind of, okay, we're the most powerful, most technically advanced country in the world, we can do anything and we can figure out like even the world's toughest questions. So that's what really we were trying to do in a large part of the 1950s. However, the most important thing is that we are in the midst of a massive Cold War with communist forces, including China and North Korea. Here's China, here's North Korea, and also here's the Soviet Union. And basically, here's the very important part. We had just found out that these countries had allegedly figured out the secret behind mind control, and they were using it to brainwash U.S. prisoners of war in Korea. So basically, the government at this point was extremely paranoid already. I know it must seem like crazy today to be scared of these kind of things, because now we're like, oh, okay, well, mind control doesn't really exist. But back then, they didn't know that. So they were extremely paranoid within the government. They thought a mole existed. They thought like a spy basically existed within the government. So they were very scared of this kind of threat. So that's why we kind of acted upon it, and maybe not in the most ethical of ways. But basically, we need to find a way to win this kind of proxy Cold War and prove our authority and power. So we did that through the establishment of something called Project MKUltra, and it was a top secret CIA research project from 1953 to 1973, developed with the goal of finding a way to control minds, specifically the minds of Soviet spies. It had more specific goals. It was initially number one, to make Soviet spies defect against their will. Number two, create a sort of robot agent, so kind of like something like Manchurian Candidate type, but like basically create an agent that would follow every single order you gave them. And number three, to wipe one's mind completely clean. So those were the three objectives of this project, or like at least what they hoped would happen as a result of these experiments, finding the solution to any of these things. That was really the goal of Project MKUltra. So really, how did they do this? So they focused on subjects that, quote, cannot fight back, unquote, such as mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers with LSD. And they provided them with, like I mentioned before, LSD, other psychedelic drugs, and they did it often without their knowledge or consent, and often for over 70 consecutive days. This is a long time, right? A long time to be drugging people without their consent. Basically kidnapping. But that was what the CIA was doing in the 1950s. That's just what happened. That was Project MKUltra. It's one of the most unethical projects that happened in the history of the United States. So really, like I mentioned before, there was LSD going on, a lot of illegal drug experimentation going on with human subjects. There was also some non-drug stuff going on, such as psychological torture, paralytics, electroshock therapy, sexual and physical abuse, and hypnosis. And these were all being conducted with the goal of finding a way to control minds. Remember that. That's what this project is about. They're trying to find a way to control minds or wipe someone's mind completely clean. And they don't really know how to do this, but the Soviet Union was kind of like, we did this already. We figured out a way behind mind control. So now we're like, oh, well, now we need to figure out this way. So we tried everything. And don't forget that this is a government funded program. Experiments ran at over 80 institutions, and people knew about this. It wasn't just like five people huddled in a room all together being like, okay, so this is, Project M Culture. It was our president knew about this, and a bunch of other intelligence agencies knew about this. This was a huge project. We'll go on the next slide about how big it was, but it was huge and it was majorly funded. So here's when we get into more of the nitty gritty stuff. The program consisted of more than 150 experiments, but most documents and data were destroyed, unfortunately. Take a look at this document on the right, where it says at the bottom that the director of the hospital is cleared through top secret and is aware of the true purpose of the project. And this is a very eerie statement, but fun fact, during this project, basically they gave instructions to doctors and psychiatrists and stuff, and they said, we will pay you if you trick your patients into consuming LSD. And this was a real thing that doctors did, for money, which was so it's like completely unethical and wrong. It was back then and it is today, but they still did this. People knew that the CIA knew this project was entirely unethical, but they still did it. This was from 1953, this document at least, and that was the year where it first started. So obviously from here things got a lot worse. So let's get more into that. The federal government spent around $87.5 million on this project, adjusted for inflation. So, like I said, people knew about this. And the paranoia within the government was so bad that it wasn't only, quote, people who couldn't fight back, unquote, that were drugged, but almost every employee of the CIA as well. So they were being drugged externally, but also internally within their own organization. So this started off as consensual drug experiments with volunteers and such, but it quickly turned into these surprise druggings, putting LSD in morning coffee and stuff and giving it to employees, because those were actually real things that they did. I'm pretty sure a CIA employee at the time even reported that the entire office was kind of scared of being drugged in one day and not even realizing it. But unfortunately, this was a reality for one CIA chemist. So Frank Olson was a CIA chemist who was a unfortunate victim to this project. He had consumed a beverage spiked with LSD, and a few years later, in 1953, he jumped to his death. So this really does show the extent of the project was extremely large, also extremely deadly and unethical. And this was within the first year this project was being conducted, right? It was insane how we didn't, put an end to this earlier, but this project continued for 20 more years after this happened. That's how bad the paranoia was within the government. So we have one death and it's been the first year, and we're still continuing with all these experiments. So now we're going to be getting on to one of the most unethical parts of the entire Project MKUltra was Operation Midnight Climax, which occurred in 1953, which was the same year that Project MKUltra started. So this is a subsection of Project MKUltra, but still very real, and it still happened. So basically what happened was that the CIA employed and lured prostitutes to safe houses where they drugged and observed them through a two-way mirror to record the effects of LSD. This was highly and blatantly illegal, very, very much so. The CIA were completely aware that it was super bad, but this still, it expanded to restaurants, it expanded to bars and beaches in California and New York City, and in 1963, finally, around 10 years after this project originally started, CIA Inspector General John Ehrman strongly recommended closing down the facilities, and in 1966, the project was defunct. Operation Midnight Climax was defunct. Remember that, not Project MKUltra itself, but only this small section of of Project MKUltra. So this is actually the direct quote from the report from 1963. You can read it yourself. But basically, this entire thing was funded by the CIA and was maybe one of the most unethical parts of Project MKUltra itself. But in reality, the entire project was extremely unethical. So this is almost a very small puzzle piece in this very large puzzle, if you get me. So that's a small part of it that's super unethical. Just want to share that. I thought it was very interesting. Okay, so here is the same report that I used earlier, this is the 1963 CIA report that indicated basically the CIA were well aware of the ethics of the project. So you can even see that in letter A, they say research and the manipulation of human behavior considered by many authorities in medicine and related fields to be professionally unethical. So they knew this was awful. They knew it was unethical. They still did it. They still did it. And it's just, insane to think that this could even happen within our government. But it did. Like, these were very real things that happened during the Cold War. This is what fear and paranoia drives people to do, right? So letter B also goes more into that. Some MK Ultra activities raise questions of legality implicit in the original charter. So basically saying that, okay, it's unethical, it's illegal, and finally, letter D, which says that public disclosure of some aspects of MK Ultra activity could induce serious adverse reactions in U.S. public opinion, as well as stimulate offensive and defensive action in this field on the part of foreign intelligence services. This is really ironic because this is exactly what happens when the word gets out that these experiments are happening. So it's almost like actual like historical foreshadowing. Like it's, almost incredible how they basically planned how the outcome of this was going to happen. But all of that happened, when this was actually released 20 years later, 20 years after it started. But really, it makes us think, who was the mastermind behind this program? And we're looking here at a man called Sidney Gottlieb. He was basically known as the creator of Project MKUltra. He was a CIA chemist and a poison expert who basically thought he could use LSD to induce psychological terror and similar, quote, techniques that would crush the human psyche to the point where it would admit anything, unquote. That is a very real quote from him. He was referred to as the mad scientist of the CIA because most of the stuff he hypothesized and most of the stuff he thought up and proposed to the CIA were absolutely insane ideas. So it's honestly a miracle how Project MKUltra even passed because he proposed ideas that concerned a lot about the assassination of foreign officials. I remember he said to the CIA that he was thinking about putting poison in this African foreign minister's his toothbrush. Like he was thinking about poisoning Fidel Castro through spraying his television with LSD and putting thallium in his shoes so that his beard would fall out. Like these were things that this guy was thinking of and proposed to the CIA. We're really looking at a historical, real, actual mad scientist here, right? And later on, far after this entire Project MKUltra thing was over in 1973, he retired from the CIA and said that none of his work had been effective, which was actually quite true because really we discovered that mind control doesn't really exist. Soviet Union said they discovered it, but really that was only a threat. So really his efforts had been futile, which is you can determine whether or not that was really upsetting yourself. Because for me personally, I don't think it's upsetting because he's tortured and psychologically tortured and funded, trauma basically for a lot of people. So but you can determine because the thing is he still contributed a lot to the CIA during that time. You just have to determine whether or not it was good or bad, and that's not really my decision to make for you. But basically, that's who Sidney Gottlieb is. Pretty crazy dude. So let's start about the actual outcome. What happened, out of this experiment? You know what I mean? So basically, what we have to remember, the Watergate scandal played a huge role in the exposure and termination of the MKUltra program. So this was in the 1970s, early 1970s, concerning the Nixon administration. So they're basically finding out that the CIA are conducting many, many other illegal activities at the time, and also a bunch of U.S. intelligence agencies are, and this causes an intergovernmental panic. So basically, this guy right here, Richard Helms, he's the director of the CIA, and in the midst of the Watergate scandal, almost all MKUltra documents are destroyed out of intergovernmental panic by Richard Helms in 1973. So here's Richard Helms, like I said before. And it's actually interesting because I had to surf through a lot of documents. I had to read through a lot of them in order to, make this slideshow. And here's actually a document I found from 20 years earlier in 1953 talking and supporting Project MKUltra. And it's by Richard Helms. Like, you can look at the bottom, it's by him, and it's just ironic that 20 years later he'd be the one who would destroy all documents related to this project, uh, and basically make it very, very hard for researchers to confirm that the kind of experiments that were happening, under this project. So yeah, quite a little bit of irony. So that was really what happened, like, federally. So let's talk about, like, how it actually got out to the public and stuff. So in 1974, New York Times journalist Seymour Hersh published a story saying that the CIA had been conducting unethical human experiments for decades with the funding of the government, and America freaked out. This is the actual, like, article itself, or at least the title of it. The real article for this is insanely long. Like, we're talking 2 pages of the newspaper long, right? He basically exposed everything that the CIA was doing. Uh, and it was, investigative journalism at its finest. But in 1975, like 1 year after this was published, President Ford sets up the United States Commission on CIA Activities. It's called the Rockefeller Commission, right? And it's to investigate illegal CIA activities and make sure something like Project MKUltra never happens again. And then in 1976, Ford's executive order on intelligence activities prohibits, quote, experimentation with drugs on human subjects, except with informed consent in writing and witnessed by a disinterested party of each such human subject. So basically, unquote. So basically, that means basically that, Project MKUltra, this kind of unconsensual human experimentation, can't happen again in the United States without actually getting consent from the person you're testing on. So that was in 1976. It was Ford Executive Order, as most commonly known. So that is pretty much the end of all of this kind of stuff. But really, if you want to think about it in a realistic standpoint, it's that probably CIA activities are still being conducted, maybe just in other countries now where those kind of regulations don't apply, those kind of criminal things don't apply, because believe it or not, Project MKUltra was also doing that kind of thing. Like the foreign thing, they were actually going to foreign countries and they were testing on people that were from different countries to avoid criminal persecution or prosecution, right? Like they were doing that in 1953, and they're probably like still doing it now. Like obviously, like you never know with this kind of thing because it's a CIA. They have a habit of keeping a lot of things top secret, but you really never know with this kind of thing. But I just find it fascinating that this thing happened in history. Such a monumental, unethical event, and not a lot of people know about it. But it really showcases the dangers of our government, and what they are doing and what paranoia can drive people to do. As crazy as it sounds, or crazy as it is. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed.